Hey Nova ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today I've got a treat for you, and it's the channel Voices of the Past. Now I've already reacted to one of their videos before, but today I found a video, specifically the one called How Far Did Rome Explore? And I thought, hey, this is such a fascinating question and topic that I've got to check this one out with the Nova ones. There is quite a lot I think I can add, because it's a topic that I studied and that always fascinated me. Of course, it's a 1 hour and 44 minutes. I'm not going to watch the entire thing. We'll just watch a section or two. Absolutely click the link in the description below or the pinned comment to go and finish watching the rest of the video. Give them a like and give them the views that they deserve. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. AD 84.
General Gnaeus Julius Agricola stood on the wet heather at the very edge of humanity. It was beginning to rain and a misty drizzle was being carried inland on the saline air. This truly was a savage place. A place where the gods had not worked their benevolence as they had on his Mediterranean home. He looked out across the deep waters of the outer edge of the known world. Campaign was over, but Agricola had one last command to undertake.
Gnaeus Julius Agricola. Yeah, already this is a correct beginning and statement. At the end of the day, the Romans did consider the Mediterranean and in general Italy not only as the center of the world, but also as the most balanced area geographically and when it comes to the weather. So the fact that it's in this place, it's rainy, it's cold, it is from the perspective of the Romans a place that it's not balanced. And the Romans did think that they had the mild and therefore best weather in the world. Of course, the world from their perspective, because they thought Africa, super hot, northern countries, super cold. But here we got the temperate, mild and best weather, which at the end of the day, I mean, we as Mediterraneans do enjoy wonderful weather.
After 4 decades of sporadic conquest and numerous setbacks, the Roman army was poised to enter the highlands of northern Caledonia to wipe out the remaining native resistance and determine the limits of Europe.
Of course, Caledonia, with a long air for phonemic vowel length in classical Latin, would be modern-day Scotland. I think most of you know that, but just for those who might not.
Agricola would go on to confirm that the British landmass was an island by navigating unfamiliar seas, exploring undiscovered coastlines, and making contact with previously unknown peoples. Calgacus, the leader of these people, the one they called the Swordsman, had said that beyond these shores lay only rocks and sea. That was probably true, but as he watched the rain clouds roll back over the northwestern sunset, Agricola wondered.
Did you notice that he's wearing in this very nice drawing? The art is wonderful. I don't know if they pay specialized artists or they buy the art like through licenses and whatnot, but regardless, notice that the scabbard is on the left. It's a little long. I mean, I imagine maybe they wanted to represent a spatha, I suppose, but what have you. But the fact that the scabbard is on the left, the sheath being carried on the left, is actually correct for both a general and in general officers, as opposed to regular legionaries who will be wearing it on the right instead. So here is just to show you a bit more iconography for this exception when it comes to officers, high officers, generals. The sword is on the left, but that's a little bit of an exception, mostly a status symbol. But when it comes to rank and file, infantry, cavalry, even Praetorian Guard, the sword is always going to be on the right. And that is because rank and file is going to have a problem drawing the sword from the left without moving the shield out of the way. Now, you want to present a cohesive shield in front of your enemy, particularly to defend you against projectiles. But if the sword is on your right side, on your right hip, then you can draw while maintaining your shield in front of you for maximum protection. And I believe that that is the reason why legionaries would wear the sword on the right.
He cast his mind back 30 years to when Emperor Claudius had just begun his conquest of Britain. Agricola had been a young student at Massalia, ancient Marseille, a Greek-founded city. Under Roman rule, it was a respected center of learning, with a prominent statue of the legendary Greek seafarer Pytheas. 4 centuries earlier, in the time of Alexander the Great, Pytheas had entered the Atlantic and explored the furthest limits of the ocean.
Yeah, he has got some amazing words, I think in the words of Strabo actually, that tells us about him, but there are some crazy descriptions of what the Northern Isles looked like, specifically the British Isles. I imagine that's where they're going. I hope the quote is one of my favorite quotes. We were discussing this with one of my researchers. It's so puzzling and mysterious. Let's see if that's where they're going.
Beyond Britain. But he had claimed to have seen a further great landmass positioned far beyond. It was his belief that 3 vast islands formed the North Atlantic Isles: Britain, Ireland, and Thule. Pytheas states that he set foot on every part of Britain. He also gives an account of Thule and describes a region where he says the land, sea, and air are no longer separate elements. Instead, there is a thick compound resembling a sea lung, which suspends itself over ocean and land, merging and binding elemental matter. This material cannot be travelled over or sailed through.
It is exactly that quote from Strabo. It is fascinating, isn't it? It sounds like he's describing like a Elden Ring area.
In the long half-light before the first stars appeared, Agricola looked out at the darkening horizon. Was the legendary island of Ultima Thule out there, at the very rim of the globe, where daylight lingered? And so he mused to himself, if he had come this far, why not go further?
This is beautifully written.
Beneath him, the Roman fleet had reassembled in a deep inlet to shelter from a sudden autumn storm. The war galleys and support vessels were making ready to range northward along the furthest seaboards of Caledonia. They would support the legions who were pushing forward into the highlands and forests. Agricola watched as the ships shifted on an incoming tide. He would have told his fleet commander what to expect out there. Roman knowledge of the North Sea suggested that latitudes beyond Britain would be subject to horrendous storms, carrying frozen currents and biting cold winds from the far north. And beyond Britain, the sea became cold and began to solidify. This process began with the platelets of floating sea ice that resembled a shoal of encroaching jellyfish.
Now, this might be a situation whereby, if you have heard about the Roman Navy, now you're hearing about their naval understanding and their mapping and exploration. So Romans as seafarers and explorers might be something that you might be like, but I thought the Romans didn't have a navy or didn't have any sort of vessels, neither war vessels nor exploration vessels. But the reality is that is not the case. That is a myth. Sure, the Romans, at least until the First Punic War, did not have a navy as majestic as that of Carthage, so the Punic navy, or the Greek powers and colonies, like in Sicily, for instance. But the Romans did have a navy. They absolutely did have a navy. It is my opinion, as I've expressed on a dedicated video, you'll find a link in the description, it is my opinion that as we interpret correctly the words of Polybius when it comes to the Roman navy before the Punic Wars, then I think it did exist, but it wasn't like that advanced. And of course, it's during But it did exist, and there is this treaty in 509 BC with the Carthaginian Republic, whereas they tell them specifically, do not go past this specific port that is in modern-day Tunisia with your vessels unless you're pushed there by the weather or you're fleeing enemies. So it does make it sound like even then, even so far back as 509 BC, the Romans already had vessels. They probably had a reasonable number of vessels, possibly including war vessels, particularly if we discuss the long ships or navis longa that are mentioned as they take Anthium and then they go to Delphi to give offerings to the gods. This long vessel is described, but in general I would say there would be no reason for Carthage to tell the Romans you are not allowed to move your vessels past this line if they didn't perceive them as a possible threat, which to me sort of pushes the strengthens the idea that even back then the Romans did have naval capability and they weren't to be underestimated. But regardless, the Romans did have a navy. They were pretty good explorers. They were mapping the seas and the oceans, so this is absolutely correct.
But as the cold increased, these ice plates merged into sheets that could immobilize, then crush timber vessels. Agricola had seen with his own eyes the white mass of a Caledonian sea mist hanging over an early frost. Truly, a compound resembling a sea lung, as Pytheas had claimed some 4 centuries prior. And so, with the Roman military about to encounter Ultima Thule, would the Roman explorers sent out by Agricola soon tread the beaches of this remote, mysterious, and semi-mythical land? But of course this was not the first time that the Romans had explored beyond the limits of the known world or crossed the boundaries of knowledge. A long sequence of adventure, conquest and ambition had led Rome and its armies far beyond the familiar, to the boundaries of the unknown. Centuries of expansion had pushed the eternal city to the ends of the earth, not only to the far north, but far east, west, and south too. And so this is that story. This is the story of the edges of the Empire.
Beautiful, beautiful. I mean, the production is excellent. Whoever is writing these scripts is writing them very, very well. One thing, so before we move to east, south, and west, let's discuss a little more about the north. So let's imagine for a moment these Roman legionaries and these legions moving northward. So where are they going? They're going to Britain, they're going to Scandinavia, they're going through Germania, and all these places have one thing in common: they are freaking cold. As someone who spent his teenage years in the UK, goodness gracious, it gets cold. And in fact, I spent some time up north as well, and Manchester was freaking freezing. Imagine like York, which was obviously a Roman place, town, that would have been freezing cold, and then of course Scandinavia, Germany, even northern France, so a period would be Gaul, that would have been really cold. So whenever we imagine the Romans, we see them with these like short tunics, legs uncovered, arms uncovered, kind of a thin tunic, and you might be thinking, wouldn't they freeze to death? And given as a Mediterranean, whenever you place me in any place that it's got like any temperature that goes beyond mild, I do suffer. So you can put me in a very hot environment and I'm fine, but when it starts to get a little cold, for me it's like very cold. But regardless of that, it's interesting to think that the way you imagine and the way you picture the Romans most likely is the Romans that are marching for combat, which means they are in summer, because summer is the campaign month. And that's why oftentimes when we see them represented in iconography, in images, in pictures, in movies, in video games, you see them in their summer clothing. But the Romans did have winter clothing, because of course, even if they are not necessarily campaigning, they could still have to fight in winter. They might be attacked in winter. They still have to. That's why they had winter forts, which were more permanent, as opposed to summer forts, which were more like something that you can build very quickly and disassemble very quickly if you need to move through the territory because you are campaigning. But they, the Romans did still operate and live in these territories during winter, even if it was generally it wasn't the campaign month. So, or season, should I say. So what that means is that when you have to imagine an ancient Roman legion or soldiers in imperial period, for example, marching, or republican, marching and living in these cold territories, you shouldn't imagine them with their summer clothing. So what would they be wearing? Well, of course, the simple tunic, the simple, I want to say, linen tunics. Some could also have cotton, but cotton was more expensive, so it kind of depends on who you are. But in general, rather than just a thin linen tunic, imagine that they would be wearing multiple tunics, and some of these could be wool. So you could have a linen tunic and then on top of that a woolen tunic. So you're already wearing two. Then they would wrap their feet with rabbit skin. So even though we could call them sandals, I mean, it's not, they're boots, they're open boots rather than sandals, but just to understand each other and get the wrath of Roman reenactors. This idea of having open shoes, you're like, oh my gosh, it's gonna get so cold. Yes, but they can wrap their feet underneath that, and they would wear udonis, so socks. So you have to imagine you're wearing woolen socks, then you can wrap around rabbit skin, insulate it, and then you put on your shoes, your boots, then, you know, your feet are fine, they're protected. Now, in certain areas, after a certain period, the Romans do start wearing trousers. They kind of copy barbarian customs, if you will. But even in those cases when they're not wearing it, sure, the legs are a little exposed. So are the legs of a lot of girls in these Nordic countries when they go out in their skirts. So at the end of the day, yeah, you'll survive that as long as the body mass and your feet, your extremities, and the center of mass where all the organs are is protected and covered. Even if the rest of your legs, you could get frost bites depending, but then again, there are ways to avoid that. Then when they could be wearing cloaks, because the Romans did wear those, and that would on top of the armor. So the armor is already insulating, and remember that wearing metal does help. And I know this might be strange, but I remember when I filmed, let me show you, this video, Miyamoto Musashi 7 years ago in samurai armor, we went up the mountains. It was so freaking cold. I do want to show you a little bit of the backstage that we've got here. So, okay, just so to show you, this was the place. It was very windy, very misty. And here I am in samurai armor walking through the fog. And of course, you don't see them, but I have a whole team around me. Cameramen, microphone people, script people. I've got probably like 9 people with me. And it was really, really, really cold. It was also very windy. So the wind was, yeah, on your face, on your hands. And here I'm even standing. So for filming, I'm not even moving, which at least could have increased my temperature a little bit. I had to stand to take the pictures and to create the footage. And it was not a problem. Like literally, the armor was insulating me to a point that only my hands were hurting. And samurai did wear gloves, so I could have worn gloves. I just didn't, I suppose, but I could have done that. And that's how we took some really awesome footage, to be honest. I need to start doing that again. As you see, standing still for pictures. So let me show you a little bit of the backstage. Here we're using a GoPro. Here's my cameraman. Look at that. He was freezing cold. You can tell how cold they are. And with all of their modern clothing, I was fine and they were still freezing. Isn't that crazy? Here we go. Yeah, look at all of them. We had a great time. That's one thing I miss. I'll have to recreate a team like photographers and microphone sound people. And here is another video that I filmed a few years ago where we actually went even to another mountain during winter, still to film in samurai armor. I mean, look at the weather conditions. And once again, in here, not even wearing a mask, and my face and my hands were really the only parts that hurt. But everything else, the armor insulated me completely. So I have to imagine that something similar would be with Roman armor. In fact, maybe next time I'm going to try this in Roman armor and see how much insulation I get. Of course, if you want to watch these videos, perhaps since they're older videos, the algorithm might not be pushing them anymore and you might still enjoy them. I'll put links in the description below. And as you see, standing still for pictures, standing still, moving just only slightly sometimes. Then we had to do multiple shots. It was still fine. I mean, yeah, it was cold. I'll be honest with you. It was really cold, but it was doable. Armor helps.
The Roman soldiers' diet was mainly wheat. Some sources tell us that salt was so prized that soldiers in the Republic were paid in salt. and this was the root of the word salary.
It's not that they were paid in salt. That's a little bit of a myth. They were salt was part of their payment in the sense that they would be rationed salt, and since salt was valuable, then they were given something valuable, but it didn't replace the money payment. That's an important statement to underline. And also when he says that their diet was mostly wheat, there is more that can be said when it comes to that. They did eat meat as well, but I might kind of correct a little more, but I want to let him speak first.
This video has been sponsored by Factor,
I see.
the best, healthiest meal
Factor is
delivery
great.
service out.
Factor is great. Beyond Carthage. Nice.
In the 3rd century BC, the embattled Roman state was largely confined to Italy, with a powerful network of Italian city-state allies.
Yeah.
But in the century that followed, proud legions captured and subdued Macedonia, seized the prosperous island of Sicily, and laid claim to territories in eastern Spain.
Represent.
And finally, after generations of persistent rivalry and warfare, they closed in on the already beaten and beleaguered Carthaginians on the coast of North Africa. Following a 3-year siege, the monumental conflict between these two opposing empires was at last concluded.
Opposing empires, they're opposing republics, to be a little pedantic about it. Because this is before, the Second Punic War, all Punic Wars end before the beginning of the empire, which is in 27 BC. So no, Carthage was not an empire, at least technically. Unless he's meaning it in a much broader sense, I suppose, because he's not the only one who mentions this. So I'm starting to think, is there a different way to say it? They do mean it? Like even the Republic is an empire? It's kind of confusing. I wouldn't support that nomenclature, but let me know if you know more than me.
The Roman general Scipio Aemilianus oversaw the final brutal capture and destruction of the seaport of Carthage. He gave orders that the Roman army should burn, destroy, and demolish everything in their path. During 6 days of savage fighting in the city streets, the order was repeatedly given to clear the thoroughfares. Wounded and dying citizens were dragged away and heaped along with corpses and debris from collapsing buildings. Then, both living and dead bodies were cast into pits filled with rubble and other charred remains. Appian writes, "To make the streets passable, they cleared the debris with axes, mattocks, and pronged tools. With these iron instruments, the dead and the living were rolled and dragged along like debris before being hurled together into pits. The trenches were filled with the dead and still living." Finally, over 50,000 traumatized survivors who had taken refuge in an inner citadel surrendered. They were secured in the iron chains of the Roman slave dealers.
Well, not all 50,000, though. It's important to remember that Carthage was still a thing. It's true that Carthage was destroyed, but when we say destruction in classical antiquity, the way we interpret that, I don't even know if that's the correct term to use, because yes, it was razed to the ground, but the ruins of the parts that were destroyed, it did remain to a point that we do know of Roman generals that sat on the ruins, so the ruins were still there. But in general, the port city existed, some population remained. It was a massacre, but they didn't take 50,000 people, completely empty it, because again, what's the point? It's one of those things as if it's better to, crush them, but then annex them and sort of govern the population, tax them. That makes a lot more sense. Destroy the politicians, destroy the leaders, destroy the military, but extirpating the entire population wouldn't make any sense. They did get slaves, absolutely, but they didn't not everyone became a slave. You shouldn't imagine, and this is one of the reasons why I really hope he's not going to go into the wrong myth of salt in the earth. That never happened. It's nonsense. So I hope he doesn't repeat that, because sometimes we have this idea, okay, they killed literally everyone, destroyed every single building, everything was razed to the ground, burnt, destroyed, and then they salted and nothing was left. No. It was an utter destruction, but not in the sense of a nuke. Okay, that's why I'm saying, sometimes when we use that word, destruction, we have to contextualize it in classical antiquity. It's razing, plundering, a lot of ending, since I can't use the K word, of people's lives, but yeah.
Surrounded by his closest advisors, Scipio oversaw this final destruction of the city from a distant vantage point. As the ruins of Carthage smoldered down to embers and ashes, Scipio is said to have suddenly stood very still, in quiet reflection. The battle was over. The threat of death was gone and the thrill of killing had subsided. He became lost in thought. Was this the ultimate destiny of all empires? Appian records, Scipio beheld the final destruction of a city which had flourished 700 years from its foundation. It had ruled over so many lands, islands, and seas. It had been prosperous with great armies and fleets, elephants and wealth of money. It had been equal to the mightiest monarchies, but surpassed them all in bravery and ambition. Now, the city had met its end in a final and complete destruction. Scipio, beholding this spectacle, is said to have shed tears and publicly lamented the destiny of his enemy. A Greek advisor called Polybius, who was standing nearby, overheard Scipio mutter a quote from Homer, a verse from the Iliad concerning the destruction of the legendary city of Troy. The great campaign was over. But what next? Perhaps, thought Polybius, a new odyssey was about to begin. Polybius turned his back on the broken city and looked out towards the sea, where new possibilities awaited. Could he become a new Odysseus? Rome was victorious, Carthage was gone, and its possessions in North Africa were now the property of the expanding Roman Empire. The sea lanes leading into the Atlantic were suddenly open to Roman shipping. But what unknown lands lay beyond the Mediterranean and the fabled Pillars of Hercules?
Yeah, then Mauritania as a province will be divided further into Mauritania Tingitana, Mauritania Caesariensis. I am producing a video, so this is not something I'm going to promise and not do, but I am producing a video where I will kind of teach, teach the names of the provinces and what they were called in period and what they would be in the modern perspective. So kind of a little bit of geography, but juxtaposed between the modern period and the classical antiquity. I'll have to kind of choose a specific time. I think I'll go for Imperial Rome during the Principate. But I think that could be really cool because people in our day and age, oftentimes they don't even know where modern countries are. I mean, a lot of people are not, and that's not even the people's fault. If you don't know European geography or your own geography, if you're not European, then it's because, not your fault, it's because you weren't taught right at school. So I think it would be nice to kind of do a twofold situation where we can learn what these provinces were like. Okay, so where would be Pontus? Where is Gallia Cisalpine Gaul? And then we learn the proper pronunciation in Latin, and then you know, we can see where they are, so we also learn a little bit. It's a fun way to learn geography, I suppose. So I'm producing that.
Scipio was determined to destroy all remnants of Carthage, and this included its diaspora. The Carthaginians had established small colonies and trade stations on the arid outer shores.
That were these are real, by the way.
The
These are some of the ruins of Carthage, so I recognize them immediately. I've used them on my videos a few times as well.
Carthaginians had established small colonies and trade stations on the arid outer shores of North Africa, modern-day Morocco. Had these Atlantic connections provided the Carthaginians with their great wealth and good fortune? Perhaps. So Scipio offered his Greek advisor Polybius command of several Roman war galleys and instructed him to find the westward limits of Carthaginian power. And so his journey west began. By following the African coast, Polybius passed the high Atlas mountain range and prepared to enter the Atlantic. But he was crossing through more than a physical limitation. He was intruding into the domain of gods, myths, heroes, and monsters. Deities always existed where practical experience faltered and common knowledge ended. As they passed into uncharted regions, Polybius and his small fleet, like Odysseus, prepared themselves for supernatural hazards, as well as physical dangers.
I like that he's giving the period perspective, because he could just tell the tale as this is where they went, that's how they did it, and this is what they encountered. But I really like about this channel is that they give a little, like, they read you the sources, they read you the passages, they tell you this is what they thought, and so I like it because it makes it more immersive. That's how I think history should always be taught, from the perspective of period people, as well as a kind of a more cold, factual approach. So kind of do a little bit of both, I think. It could create a good...
To begin with, it was said that the world-bearing Titan, Atlas, held the weight of the sky on his shoulders. Indeed, the fossilized remains of this godlike giant might yet be seen in the high Atlas Mountains. Perhaps its massive form would be glimpsed as a vast mountain column projecting upwards, far beyond the tallest peaks. The Romans strained their eyes looking inland at the ranges to discern the shape or form of the primordial Titan. At the edge of the Mediterranean, a high cliff-like promontory hove into view on the European coast. This was the Rock of Gibraltar, which formed one flank of the legendary Pillars of Hercules, the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. It was said that the legendary demigod Hercules had cut a channel through a mountain to join the seas and enter the Atlantic, though other accounts suggested Hercules had merely fortified an existing sea passage, so that giant oceanic monsters might not stray into the peaceful Mediterranean. This rock-hewn passage was the strait through which Polybius and his ships now passed. As he passed this legendary spot, Polybius must have considered the reports of his Greek forebears, who had themselves heard second-hand accounts from Carthaginian seafarers. For it had been in the 6th century BC that a Carthaginian commander named Hanno the Navigator had voyaged beyond the Pillars of Hercules and explored the western seaboard of the African continent.
Right.
Hanno had left an account of his voyage. This had been translated into Greek and circulated among Roman authorities in an abbreviated form. It was said that Hanno had commanded a settler fleet intended to colonize distant regions, but south of Morocco the Carthaginians had encountered only a bleak and hostile coastline. The Greek writer Arrian read the translated report. As Hanno...
I don't know why it makes me think of the video game Valheim. If you know, you know. I don't even need to explain it. If you don't know, it would take me too long to explain what I mean. I might be playing it on my 3rd channel, though, one of these days. I'll do a full-on playthrough, perhaps live. And but if you do know, you get the boat with your friends and you start exploring, and then you see, oh goodness gracious, that's swampland, oh goodness gracious, that's Black Forest, you know.
Hanno sailed south, he encountered crippling obstacles. A lack of water, scorching heat, and streams of lava gushing into the sea. Perhaps these explorers had sailed beyond the southern limit of the vast Sahara Desert and witnessed volcanic lava spilling
Yeah, it does make it sound like they went further beyond, further south.
into the sea at Mount Cameroon. Even more terrifying were the human-like creatures encountered in the region. Hanno had reported, in this lagoon was another island, full of savages. Most of them were women with hairy bodies, whom our interpreters called gorillas. Although we chased them, we could not catch any males. They all escaped since they were good climbers and could defend themselves with stones. However, we caught 3 women. They refused to follow those who carried them off, biting and clawing at them. So we killed them and flayed them and brought their skins back to Carthage. We could not sail any further because our provisions were running short. These pelt-like skins had been taken to Carthage and hung as curiosities in the temple of the goddess Tanit, macabre trophies lingering on as a testament to a strange, never-to-be-repeated voyage.
But never to be repeated, kind of depends, I suppose. Okay, so this is...
Beyond this is the River Non, which being with wild in a wilder records. After sailing round the coast, Polybius reported that, in a westerly direction beyond Mount Atlas, there are forests teeming with wild animals that Africa produces. Beyond this is the river Non, which is full of crocodiles and hippopotami.
Okay, this is very good that they're presenting this because it connects to what I said in my video dedicated to Gladiator 2. Because if you remember, I did say that even though we do see a Naumachia represented, so the naval battles or the reproduced naval battles within the Colosseum, which absolutely occurred in imperial times, in the Republic they usually did it outside the Colosseum in specifically dug arenas, but in this case in imperial time it happened in the Colosseum. But the idea that they used sharks is very improbable. The Romans were absolutely knowledgeable of sharks. In fact, they were farming them, fish farming sharks in the coasts outside of Rome. But the transportation of sharks due to their respiratory systems would have been extremely complicated. Not impossible, depending on the species. Not all sharks breathe the same way, but regardless, I think it would have been a lot more probable, as I mentioned on that video, that they would have filled the waters with crocodiles and hippopotami, because that's what the sources mention. So this is an interesting other source by Polybius that tells us that yes, they encountered them and they knew, the Carthaginians did, but the Romans were aware of these animals in Africa. And then we have other sources, the ones that I mentioned on my dedicated review of Gladiator 2, that tell us that they brought these to Rome and put them in the Naumachia inside the Colosseum, and put them during Naumachia in the waters to make it crazier, more of a spectacle. Okay, and this kind of finishes the west part, and then we will go into hunting and then incense trails and the east, south, and all that. So, okay, so I'm just going to do this for now because I want to make sure that you like it, and also encourage you to go and watch the original video. But if you enjoyed this episode, let me know in the comments below, and then next time we might go south with them or north or what have you. Thank you for watching. Of course, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow for my next daily upload. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.